Look, every single shot fired on Rick Ross' brand new album Set in Stone just detonated the entire rap map, and if you thought the smoke had cleared in 2026, you have no idea what's actually buried inside this record. Ricky Rose didn't come with subtweets. Ricky Rose didn't come with vague bars. Ricky Rose came with a chisel and a headstone, and by the time the last track fades, there are 7 names carved into the granite. 7. Not 1. Not 2. 7 high-profile targets scattered across this album like landmines, and half the internet still hasn't found them all. So let's crack the vault wide open, because what's on this record is not just a diss, it is the war rap forgot how to end, restarted in broad daylight, with receipts, with names, with dates, with dollar figures, and with a title that Rick Ross chose specifically to tell the culture that whatever gets said on this project is never coming back off. Rick Ross vs. 50 Cent. That is the fault line. That is the tectonic plate that has been grinding under hip-hop since January 2009, and I want you to sit with that number for a second, because we are 17 years deep into this feud, and Rick Ross is still emptying the clip. 17 years. Presidents have come and gone. Empires have risen and folded. Entire rap careers have started, peaked, imploded, and been forgotten in the time this beef has been active. And Rick Ross is still writing verses aimed at the same man he first swung at when Mafia music leaked to the internet in the dead of winter 2009. That is not a rap beef. That is a lifetime commitment. That is a decades-long grudge match that Rick Ross has decided, in the summer of 2026, is finally ready for its final chapter. And on Set in Stone, Rick Ross does not soften the blow. He walks straight to the microphone on the cut Mahogany Caskets, and I want you to feel the weight of that title, because Rick Ross is literally naming the song after the box he wants his opponent buried in, and he says the quiet part loud. He curses 50 Cent's name straight into the record with zero decoration. No metaphor. No riddle. No coded language. Just a middle finger with a beat under it. And here's the twist that most fans slept on, T.I. is featured on that same track. T.I., who has his own running war with 50 Cent, who himself recently released a stream of shots at 50's whole camp. Rick Ross didn't just throw a punch, Rick Ross put together an alliance. 2 Southern legends on one record, both loading rounds into the same target. That is coordinated warfare. That is not 2 rappers venting on wax. That is 2 grown men with matching grievances pooling ammunition on a song titled after a coffin. Basically, Rick Ross is saying, you thought this was over? It hasn't even reached its second act. Then comes the bar that broke Twitter in half. On the track 23, Rick Ross drops a line about doing something unspeakable to 50 Cent's baby mother, for 4 songs. Now, everyone who knows this beef knows the history. In 2009, 50 Cent flipped the script and made Rick Ross' own baby mother into on-camera content, humiliating him publicly in a way that has never left the archive. So when Rick Ross swings back 17 years later and claims he did the same in reverse, most listeners assumed he was inventing revenge on wax. But look closer at the number, 4 songs. Rick Ross isn't just bragging. Rick Ross is counting his diss tracks. The 4 foundational shots he took at 50, Mafia Music, Kiss My Pinky Ring, In Cold Blood, and Push Him Over the Bridge. 4 songs. That is the whole point of the bar. Rick Ross is telling 50 Cent that every one of those diss records was a violation, and every one of them counted, and every one of them still lives on streaming platforms that will never delete them. That is Rick Ross rewriting history in real time. That is Rick Ross reaching into the past, dragging it into 2026, and forcing 50 Cent to relive the entire war on Rick Ross terms. But then Rick Ross does something even bolder. On the record Big Fish, he addresses the single most damaging moment of his entire career, the corrections officer exposé. In the rap codebook, that reveal was a cardinal violation. Rick Ross was rapping about kilos moving through the port of Miami, painting himself as a kingpin with a jet engine strapped to his back. And then 50 Cent produced the photographs, the paperwork, the receipts. Rick Ross had worked as a corrections officer. In hip-hop terms, that should have been the end of a career. It wasn't. Because Rick Ross did something no other rapper in his position ever pulled off, he absorbed the punch, called it a job, and kept the character intact. On Set in Stone, he does it again, telling us he was just a CEO on the clock, that a paycheck is a paycheck, that we all did what we had to do to get in position, that there is nothing shameful about a young man working inside a system while planning his exit from it. It is one of the most audacious pieces of narrative jiu-jitsu in modern hip-hop, and Rick Ross is still using it as armor in 2026. 17 years after the leak, and Rick Ross is still refusing to fold on the story. Now let's talk about Drake. Because here is where the story gets weird. Everyone expected Rick Ross to nuclearize Drake on this project. Everyone. The context demanded it. Drake had literally name-dropped Rick Ross on the Iceman album earlier this cycle, tossing what most of the culture read as a shot at the boss. So the expectation coming into Set in Stone was that Rick Ross would return fire with a napalm strike. Instead, Rick Ross went cold. Surgical. Almost dismissive. And that is somehow more devastating than any full-scale diss track could have ever been. Because when Rick Ross treats you with contempt instead of rage, Rick Ross is telling the entire industry that you are not worth the full album cycle. Cue up the track called Maybach Music 7. Rick Ross rides the beat like he's taking a Sunday drive and drops the line, streams before Ross had ever get punched in the face, some TLC, 'cause my need for your left eye. Straight up, Rick Ross is telling Drake that Drake got physically embarrassed while Rick Ross was building an empire, that Drake doesn't want a real conflict because Drake is not from the streets. And then Rick Ross tightens the noose one bar later. I wrote a few of your rhymes to show you what it could be. Read that twice. Rick Ross is claiming, on record, on wax, on the same album Drake will be forced to listen to, that he wrote lyrics for Drake. In the rap codebook, that is a beheading. Because Drake, in the year 2026, remains the most publicly exposed ghostwriting story in the genre, and every rapper alive knows that when you accuse someone of not writing their own bars, Drake is the walking billboard for that argument. Rick Ross did not pick that accusation randomly. Rick Ross picked the one accusation that has hunted Drake since Meek Mill first pulled the receipts a full decade ago, and Rick Ross reloaded that same round in 2026. Rick Ross is a clever writer. Rick Ross does not miss. And 2 bars later, he lets the pin drop. He says, champagne toast just amongst my folks. Champagne. That's Drake's own online alias, Champagne Poppy, surgically inserted into the very next line to remove any doubt about who the target is. Rick Ross doesn't have to say Drake's name. Rick Ross says champagne, and the entire internet fills in the blank. That is not a diss. That is a signature carved into wet cement. That is Rick Ross telling the listener, I know exactly who I am talking about, and I know exactly how to make sure you know it too, without ever giving Drake the courtesy of a full name. And Rick Ross keeps swinging. He hits Drake again with, I've been the nicest since before you got a license. Then, you still biting my rhymes, I could sue you for my likeness. Rick Ross is essentially saying that Drake has been feeding off of him, off of his style, off of his cadence, off of his blueprint, since Drake was still learning to drive a car. And it doesn't stop there. On the very next track, Rick Ross drops another whisper. On Camel Meat he says, hope you wrote a few rhymes, heard your opening lines. That is a callback to the very intro of Drake's Iceman album, where Drake opened the record referencing his Toronto roots. Rick Ross claps back that Toronto is not the streets, that his Florida people are more thorough, and, again, that Drake had better hope he wrote those opening bars himself. It is calm. It is confident. It is contemptuous. And it is designed to make Drake lose sleep. Rick Ross is not just responding to Drake. Rick Ross is auditing Drake's entire pen game in front of 30 million listeners. Now for the shot no one saw coming. Jay-Z ate a stray round on this album, and almost every single review missed it. On the record Ring Around the Rolls, Rick Ross drops a line that on first listen sounds like a wide swipe at industry politics. All these dudes is on the Epstein list. Just one problem. In the entire recorded history of hip-hop, the Epstein documents released to the public only ever surfaced 2 rap industry names, Pusha T and Jay-Z. That's it. So when Rick Ross uses the plural, all these dudes, every listener with a working memory knows exactly which door that key opens. And it is not Pusha T. Because Rick Ross and Pusha T have no known conflict, no shared history of aggression, no reason for Rick Ross to reach across the industry and toss darts at Virginia. But Rick Ross and Jay-Z? That relationship has been quietly evolving for the last 2 years, and this bar is the first public confirmation that something has actually cracked between them. That's the read. Draw your own line. But it deepens. Rick Ross recently sat down with the Joe Budden podcast, and Joe asked him point-blank why Rick Ross was not on stage at Jay-Z's 30th anniversary concert, an event where nearly every friend Jay ever made pulled up to perform. Rick Ross' answer was cold. Not warm. Not brotherly. Just a shrug and a glad y'all felt the vibrations. That is not the language of a man who was denied by circumstance. That is the language of a man who chose to sit it out. Combine that podcast moment with the Epstein bar on Set in Stone, and you are looking at what might be the beginning of the most understated rap divorce in modern history. Rick Ross and Jay-Z, two men who built empires side by side for over a decade, are now standing in different rooms. And nobody in the industry press has been willing to write that headline yet. But Rick Ross just wrote it himself, on wax, in 2026, on a song most listeners will spin past without ever noticing what he just admitted. And Rick Ross is not done painting. Gunplay, the former Triple C soldier, the man Rick Ross once described as one of his closest brothers, took collateral fire on this album too. Not a full diss. Not a nuclear strike. Just a knowing bar, dropped like a photograph slid across the table, that references the recent interviews where Gunplay spoke about Rick Ross with less than brotherly warmth. In one of those sit-downs, Gunplay said flat out that he and Rick Ross don't talk, that Rick Ross controls the money, that Rick Ross controls the budgets, that when the big dog decides you don't eat, you don't eat. Gunplay later tried to walk it back, softening the language, saying his door was still open to Rick Ross, that they could still smoke a joint and talk business. But the internet does not forget. And on Set in Stone, Rick Ross lets Gunplay know, I saw the interview, I heard what you said, and here is a bar for the archive. That is Rick Ross telling a former blood brother that loyalty is a receipt and the receipt has been filed. Then Rick Ross does something almost surgical. He aims a bar at DJ Akademiks. Yes. That DJ Akademiks. On the record, Rick Ross essentially asks the listener to go ask Akademiks who runs the rap business, implying the answer is Rick Ross himself. Here's the catch, and here is why this bar is so strange it doesn't add up. Akademiks, in the year 2026, is one of the most publicly aligned voices in support of Drake. Ask Akademiks who runs rap on any metric, lyricism, videos, streams, revenue, and Akademiks is going to say Drake before he says Rick Ross, every single time, without hesitation, without qualifier, without ambiguity. So why did Rick Ross reach for that particular name? Two possibilities. Either Rick Ross is trolling, deliberately naming a Drake ally to force the internet into a Rick versus Drake framing loop and drive Akademiks into a 2-week reaction cycle that promotes the album for free. Or Rick Ross genuinely believes Akademiks will one day flip, and Rick Ross is planting a seed on wax that he can point back to when the flip happens. Either way, it is one of the most misunderstood bars on the entire album, and it is going to be dissected on hip-hop podcasts for months. Rick Ross weaponized a name and dared the industry to explain it. And now, the moral climax. Because Rick Ross saves the most controversial shot for the deepest cut on the album. Queso's father. Yes. The father of the rapper Queso, who in the last year became the center of one of the ugliest snitching debates in hip-hop history. For those who missed it, Queso allegedly committed a crime, and his own father chose to cooperate with law enforcement. The father has publicly defended his decision, framing it as a parent trying to save his child from a longer sentence, framing it as an intervention rather than a betrayal. But in the rap codebook, cooperation is cooperation, and there is no asterisk. On Set in Stone, Rick Ross unloads. He calls Queso's father a rat. He calls him a badge. He calls him a stain. And the reaction across the culture has been split down the middle, because Rick Ross is delivering a moral sermon on snitching while sitting on top of a corrections officer resume that 50 Cent laminated and handed to the world 17 years ago. The stones are being thrown from inside a very transparent glass house, and everybody with an internet connection can see it. And here is the part nobody wants to talk about. On the same Set in Stone album where Rick Ross condemns Queso's father for cooperation, Rick Ross features Gucci Mane. Gucci Mane, whose own history includes a widely discussed incident involving poo slime that many in the culture have described as cooperation adjacent. So when Rick Ross draws a hardline against snitching on one track and platforms Gucci Mane on the next, the contradiction is not subtle. It is the size of a billboard. Now, does that ruin the album? No. Rick Ross is a businessman, and Gucci Mane sells units, and Rick Ross has always understood that a feature is a currency, not a covenant. But it is worth naming the tension out loud, because that tension is exactly what makes Set in Stone one of the most fascinating albums Rick Ross has ever released. It is a record that is simultaneously self-aware and self-blind, and that combination is rare, And it is exactly the kind of contradiction that keeps a project trending for 8 straight weeks instead of 8 straight days. Let's zoom back out for a second, because the pattern here is not accidental. Rick Ross is not spraying bullets. Rick Ross is drawing a family tree of grievances. 50 Cent, the founding enemy. Drake, the modern rival. Jay-Z, the fractured big brother. Gunplay, the estranged soldier. Akademiks, the rival's ally. Queso's father, the moral scapegoat. 6 confirmed targets, and a 7th, Gucci Mane's shadow, hanging over the album whether Rick Ross meant to place it there or not. One album. 17 years of stored ammunition finally unloaded into a single 68-minute vinyl press. Nobody in the current rap climate is playing chess like Rick Ross. Nobody. Nobody in 2026 is stacking this many opponents onto one project and still walking away with a top 10 Billboard debut. Rick Ross is doing something the industry stopped believing veteran rappers could still do. And this is the moment where I have to stop and give Rick Ross something a lot of critics have refused to give him lately: respect. Because think about it. Rick Ross has been rich for 2 decades. Rick Ross has real estate portfolios worth more than most major label rosters. Rick Ross has restaurant chains. Rick Ross has a podcast empire. Rick Ross has zero reason to enter a rap war in 2026. He does not need the streams. He does not need the headlines. He does not need the drama. And yet Rick Ross chose the war anyway. He chose to load the album. He chose to name the names. He chose to bury the axe and then dig it back up and sharpen it, on record, for the entire culture to listen to. That is not desperation. That is not attention-seeking. That is a man who understands that his legacy is being written right now, in real time, and he is grabbing the pen back before someone else writes it for him. Now, the honest side. Is Set in Stone a perfect album? No. There are skips. There are moments where the beats overpower the pen. There are stretches where Rick Ross leans on the Maybach music formula a little too hard, where the horns feel recycled, where the flow patterns loop back on themselves. But when this album is on, when the Caviar intro opens the record with that cinematic string swell, when Maybach Music 7 lands with that trademark drum roll, when Mahogany Caskets hits its second verse and Rick Ross starts stacking syllables like bricks in a wall, Rick Ross is operating at a level most rappers half his age cannot touch. And the sequencing of the dices is masterful. Rick Ross opens with 50, because 50 is the origin story. Rick Ross moves to Drake, because Drake is the current headline. Rick Ross drifts into the Jay-Z ambiguity because Jay-Z is the mythology. And Rick Ross closes on Queso's father because the moral note is the loudest note. That is not a random track list. That is a novelist's outline. That is a rapper who understands that an album is a story, and a story only lands when the beats are placed in the right order. And the industry is going to react. Watch for it. 50 Cent is not going to stay silent. 50 Cent lives on Instagram, and Instagram is 50 Cent's diss track platform of choice in 2026. No producer required, no engineer required, just a caption and a receipt. Drake is not going to stay silent either. Drake has responded to every serious provocation in the last 3 album cycles, and Rick Ross just handed him an entire buffet. The only question is whether Drake responds directly or whether Drake sends a proxy, because Drake has learned that direct responses to Rick Ross rarely land the way Drake intends them to. Jay-Z, on the other hand, will almost certainly say absolutely nothing, because saying nothing is Jay-Z's most powerful weapon and always has been. Jay-Z speaks through silence. Jay-Z speaks through business moves. Jay-Z speaks through the calendar. And Akademiks is going to livestream about this album for the next 2 weeks straight, which is exactly the free promotion Rick Ross was engineering with that bar. Rick Ross is not just making music. Rick Ross is engineering headlines. Rick Ross is playing a media game most rappers do not even know they are supposed to be playing. So here is the final read on Set in Stone. This is not just an album. This is a cartography of every single one of Rick Ross' modern enemies, drawn in ink, pressed onto vinyl, and released on the exact moment the culture had begun to forget how many chess pieces Rick Ross still had on the board. Whether you love Rick Ross or you think Rick Ross should have hung up the pen 5 albums ago, you cannot deny the audacity of this project. 7 names. 1 record. 0 apologies. And a title, Set in Stone, that Rick Ross chose deliberately, Because Rick Ross wanted every listener to understand that whatever he says on this album, he is not taking back. Not now. Not next year. Not ever. This is not a diss album that expires. This is a monument. And every name on it is engraved for the archive. The war rap forgot how to end just got restarted. And Rick Ross fired the first shot in 2026. Drop your verdict in the comments. Who took the worst hit on Set in Stone, 50 Cent, Drake, or Jay-Z? Which bar rewrote your ranking of Rick Ross in the culture? Was the Akademiks name drop a mistake, or was it the smartest chess move on the entire track list? Do you think Drake is legally obligated to respond, or is silence the smarter move? And is Rick Ross a hypocrite for condemning Queso's father while platforming Gucci Mane on the same project, or is Rick Ross simply being a businessman who understands that a feature is not a friendship? I want to hear every take. Every angle. Every counterpoint. Because the second Drake, 50, or Jay-Z says a single syllable back, we are locking in for the response breakdown, and you are not going to want to miss what comes next. Hit that subscribe button so the next chapter of this war lands in your feed the second it drops. And if you made it this far, you already know, you are the real ones. Stay locked in. One love, one time.